The Global Positioning System is over 50 years old. When it was developed, no one imagined all of the different ways it would be used by both civilians and the military. As we look forward to regulation of new technologies like artificial intelligence, what policy development lessons can we learn from the history of GPS? Here with some thoughts on that is Systems Director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation, Dr. Brian Weeden. Dr. Weeden, thank you so much for joining me in studio today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, we're going to talk about GPS, and in your paper, you call it a global utility. How did something become something billions of people use every day?
That's a great question. And it is a bit unusual in this case because at its heart, GPS is a military system that was developed by the U.S. military for a certain set of reasons, military reasons. But yes, it has evolved into this global utility. And, what I talk about in the paper is that in large part that is because of some policy decisions that were made across multiple U.S. administrations, which opened up GPS to a lot of non-military uses. We call that commercial or civil uses. And those policy decisions, while, there was some forethought, in a lot of cases, we didn't know what would happen. We maybe know what might happen.
It sounds a little bit like how we're thinking about AI today. We want to shape a policy regime that allows flexibility and allows the policy to move forward or the technology to move forward without constraints, but we're not exactly sure what's going to happen to it in the process. Tell us a little bit more about how that worked for GPS.
Yeah, no, there is some similarity to that. In fact, there's a whole category we refer to as dual-use technologies that have, military applications, but also lots of other applications. And one of the reasons I looked into GPS was to learn more about how we do decisions on dual-use technologies, because the lessons from things like GPS are applicable to cryptography. They're applicable to a whole range of other technologies. I think one of the big things to keep in mind as we look back at this history is when you have something that has many uses, there's a lot of stakeholders or constituencies that want to have a say in the process. So one of the big things is when you do GPS policy, it was done through what we call the interagency process, where multiple departments and agencies, Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, NASA, Department of Defense, others, they all have a say in that process, and they might all have their own interests and way of looking at things. And so the question is, how do you run an effective process that brings together all those different viewpoints to then shape the policy for all those different uses? The second thing that comes out of this that we learned from GPS is there's often disagreements between those different stakeholders. So, for example, on GPS, during the Clinton administration, you had the Department of Defense, who was very concerned about preventing hostile actors from using GPS in bad ways against us. But you had the Federal Aviation Administration that wanted to use GPS to help land aircraft. And in some way, those are in tension with each other. So a big part of the GPS policy process was how do you resolve those tensions between the different stakeholders that may want to see different things out of the system.
Not only resolving them across different agency stakeholders, but the policy development that you talk about transcended multiple presidential administrations and across parties, Reagan, Clinton, and then Bush. How impactful was that? Did you find a lot of swings in the strategic approach to GPS?
Yeah, it was a long-running issue in part because the program has been around for a long time. It officially was conceived in the early 1970s as an official program. So it's been around for a while. That's why it kind of stretches across multiple administrations. Also, we find when we look at space policy decisions, there is a surprisingly high degree of consistency between administrations. And those decisions tend not to be as partisan as maybe some other policy issues, in part because they're often talked about in terms of the technology itself, or the space capability or the space system isn't a partisan issue to begin with. And so that is another reason why we've seen, as you mentioned, a lot of consistency across multiple administrations, both Democrat and Republican. In general, it's all been sort of moving in the same direction when it comes to space policy over the last few decades.
Well, that's good to hear that there's been some consistency and some continuity. In your earlier remarks, you mentioned the dual-use nature of GPS. Can you just clarify that for us a little bit and talk about how that complicates policy decisions?
Sure. So as I mentioned in the beginning, GPS is inherently a military system. It was designed and developed by the Department of Defense to serve military functions. But from the very beginning, the people working on the system realized it had a lot of other applications. I mentioned landing aircraft. Of course, nowadays we use it to navigate and order Ubers and, drop our kids off. And then there's a whole host of other applications for the timing signals and other things. So that's what we mean by dual use, where there's generally military and non-military applications. And how that comes into play in the policy decisions is sometimes you want to do things to satisfy what the military needs, but how do you also satisfy these other set of users? The great example I'll give more detail on is the Clinton administration. The military had put in place something called selective availability, which added a random error of up to 100 meters or 100 yards on the civilian GPS signals. And they did that so adversaries couldn't use those signals to target bombs or do defense things. But when the FAA wanted the same signals to land aircraft, 100 meters random error is a bit of a challenge. So the FAA was working on a separate system that allowed you to work back out that error. That created a conflict between the DoD that was deliberately putting this error in and the FAA who wanted to work the error out. And that was a big part of what prompted the Clinton decision process in the mid-90s.
That is fascinating. I'm speaking with Dr. Brian Weeden. He is the Systems Director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. All right, well, GPS was the big dog on the block for a long time, but now there are international competitors and other sources that are rising because GPS has some reliability aspects. So what are the gaps, I guess, or the threats to GPS signals today, and how do we think about them in an international collaboration space?
Well, I tend to think of the threats, and we're talking here the threats, not the military threats, but necessarily, but the threats to all those commercial and civil applications. And that's really driven by the ubiquity and the utility of GPS. It's everywhere. It's used for a lot of things. And there are military national security aspects to what we call global navigation satellite systems. And that has prompted a lot of research and investment into ways to deny those signals. What we're seeing at the moment are a few different categories. You have, I'll say, sort of limited one-off interruptions. There was a famous case more than a decade ago of a truck driver who had a GPS jammer installed in his truck so his company couldn't track his movements. Turns out every time he drove past the Newark airport, it would interfere with the GPS system.
Not drive past the Newark airport.
Right.
Yeah, that's a problem.
So that's an example of kind of a more limited case. There are other challenges we're seeing with ongoing armed conflicts around the world, really going on in Ukraine, the Middle East, where there is deliberate jamming and spoofing and interference with GPS for the military conflicts, but it is spilling over and having effects on civil users. In the paper, we talk about this really fascinating report from the aviation community that talks about what the impact is on all of the airlines operating in those parts of the world and how they're having to deal with these outages of GPS. And it's really a case of kind of a victim of its own success, if I could put it that way, where it is so useful and it's so much everywhere that we're now having to deal with sort of these unforeseen challenges.
But at the same time, the technology is 40, 50 years old. So is the United States investing adequately in a next-gen GPS?
GPS has been evolving as a program for decades, as I mentioned earlier. And yes, the U.S. military is investing in it. In fact, they just launched the new generation of satellites just in the last few days. And they're in the process of always upgrading the signals and rolling out new satellites. We should mention that there's also other international versions of GPS. The Europeans have something called Galileo. China has something called Beidou. Russians have GLONASS. The Japanese and the Indians both have a regional system that's not available globally, but it's available in their area of the world. They're all doing similar things. Part of the challenge is even if you are upgrading the technology, you're still sending signals from space pretty far away. There are just some inherent kind of vulnerabilities that are going to be there, even with the attempts to upgrade the technologies.
So here we are in the 21st century. We're thinking about the future of GPS. We're thinking about AI. We're thinking about other regulatory regimes. What lessons do you want policymakers to take for today from the history of GPS policy development?
Yeah, one of the big ones that we see looking back is the difficulty in predicting the future. It's really hard, especially when you're dealing with these kind of technologies that can either evolve very fast or where you just don't know what the potential uses are going to be. And one thing that we found over these decades of working the GPS policy is, if you can shape the policies to be kind of giving general guidance in a broad view rather than really specific direction, that tends to hold up more over the long term. And we hopefully we'll see that in other areas where we have a similar challenge of, we know there's technology, there's potential, but we don't really know how it's going to be used.
Humans are incredibly creative, both for good and for bad. So I think you have a statement in here that maybe sums it all up, which is, be clear-eyed about what can and cannot be controlled.
Yeah, and that really gets to efforts by several of the governments involved in this process, where they tried to control the spread of the technology, or they tried to control how it was used. Some of those really didn't work out too well, and we had to go back and recalibrate the policy. Now, there are some areas where they knew, okay, this part of the system, we, the government, really have strong controls over it, and that worked out well. But there's other parts of the GPS system, for example, the end receivers that we all have in our phones, in our cars, and pretty much every device. That was opened up. That is where a lot of the innovation has come from, and that's an area where the government has very little control and realized it really didn't have a lot of control in.
That's a good reminder for all of us. I've been speaking with Dr. Brian Weeden, a systems director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. You're welcome.
We'll post this interview along with a link to his paper at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.